I have a very special Dr. Brian McDonough show today. My guest is Mark Malkoff. If there is an expert on Johnny Carson, it is Mark Malkoff.
The book is called Love Johnny Carson. To me, the title reflects that so many people that I interviewed told me I loved Johnny Carson. I love Johnny Carson, and they miss him. And it was such a special part of their lives, that time going on the show, working on the show, and just to hear the stories. I it really opened up a world for me that I didn't really know in terms of how much people did truly love him.
I am a big fan of people who interview people and listen to what they say as opposed to get their 6 or 7 questions out. And the one thing I noticed about you, you let your guests throughout all of those interviews speak.
Oh, I'm glad that you said that. Early on, I think I was interrupting people a little bit too much, and I have to say, I was getting some constructive criticism. People were really nice, and it helped me, I think, as an interviewer, just kind of let people finish their top whatever they're saying, and yeah, it was refreshing. I think Johnny was a really good listener, and I've watched so much Carson. I'm sure that rubbed off on me as well, but I appreciate that.
And I came across a gentleman named Henry Bushkin who only knew the name because he used to call Johnny would call him the bombastic Bushkin.
That's right.
And I reached out to this guy
Mhm.
and he agreed to an interview. Question I have, I didn't see you through all those interviews interview Bushkin. Did you interview him and I have missed it, or did you intentionally not interview him?
I did not reach out to him. I've never met him. I've never asked him to be on the podcast. Just from talking to people that knew him, and I just didn't think it would be a good fit. And I read his book, and there were some things in there, in his book that, and I'm sure a lot of it's true. Maybe most of it's true, but there were just a few things that I just from the research I have done, I didn't find accurate. I just didn't think it would be a good fit for
Okay.
what I was doing. He's mentioned in the book because other people mention him in my book, Love Johnny Carson. But yeah, I mean, he was with Carson from, I think it was like 1971 or 1970 up until it's like 87 or something. So we definitely spent a lot of time with him.
I was just curious about that because, and by the way, there were
Yeah.
certain things I didn't ask him either because I just felt it really wasn't what I really wanted to talk about as far as Johnny
Yeah.
Carson was concerned. The one thing that I did ask him,
Yeah.
because it kind of came back and forth over the years, is when Johnny Carson felt betrayed or he
Mhm.
felt someone turned on him or was unethical or whatever, he could basically just boom, shut him out. Did your guests talk about that when you spoke with them?
A little bit. I mean, the thing is with Carson, he would talk about it on there. He would talk about his struggles on the air. And one thing, he was just really sensitive, more than I think a normal person. So something that would hurt his feelings, for example, he was friends with Carl Sagan, the astronomer, a famous guy. And Sagan twice on an episode corrected Johnny and interrupted him. And Johnny, just for whatever reason, thought that was poor manners. It hurt his feelings, never had him on again. It could be something like that. It could be um, if definitely the manners thing was big. Johnny was big at. He's having a guest in his home, and if somebody said something that he thought was too off color or whatever, he wouldn't have them back. But if he felt hurt by anybody, real or perceived, if he felt that way, he would just they didn't exist anymore. It wasn't a matter of that he would at least the people that I talked to told me he would get revenge. It was just they didn't exist in his mind anymore. I think that was just as a defense mechanism, but that was consistent.
In your conversations and again in the book,
Yeah.
the people you spoke to, many people worked with him day in, day out, and those people seem to have the greatest respect for him. Stage managers and others who would
Yeah.
just tell wonderful stories about him, his how quick he was, and how he would react to things, and how professional he was. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, he expected everybody to do their best. He only hired the best. He expected him for himself to lead that. He demanded excellence. And when you're working with somebody that is so good at what they want to do, everyone rises to the occasion. One of the most telling things that people told me that knew Johnny very well, that were friends with him, and he did have friends, believe it or not, they would say, and wife number two said this, Joanne Carson. Consistently, I was told that if Johnny felt comfortable with the person, known them for a long time, felt comfortable that he was almost the same Johnny off camera that he was on camera, a little less gregarious, some say, but I thought that that was really, really telling. But it was a very small circle of people that he felt comfortable with because he was so famous. Everybody was trying to get a piece of him. And on show days when he was at work, I mean, he was like a starting quarterback every day, conserving his energy. So he wasn't out and about, chumming it along with people. He protected his energy at all cost. I mean, he wouldn't have lunch with somebody on a show day. He was in Burbank, or he was in Malibu or Bel Air, wherever he was living at the time, working on the show from the moment he got up. Would only get to the studio a few hours before just to protect his energy level, and then he would go out there. In the beginning, he was doing an hour and 45 minutes, 5 nights a week. It's unbelievable. Went down to 90 minutes, eventually 60 minutes. But the guy had to protect his energy. And also, the FBI and the police were involved on threats to his life constantly. I mean, Mark David Chapman, who assassinated John Lennon, had a short list of people if it wasn't John Lennon, and Johnny Carson was on the list. So Johnny, the whole cold and aloof thing that the media would make that out to be, was from me talking to people that knew Johnny well, it was self-preservation. I mean, the guy was nobody would leave him alone. I mean, it was really, really hard on him.
I know, for instance, he would go to England, he would go to Europe, just he wasn't quite as recognized just because he couldn't go down the street.
Yeah, once he started hosting the Oscars, because the Oscars are global, that changed. But for a long time, he could do that, and I was told that he really enjoyed the at first. You could do anything. Nobody was coming up to him, or very few people would recognize him. But by the end of the trip, it was just, it was one of those things where. I think it bothered him a little bit, and if an American did recognize him, he really enjoyed it by the end of the visit. But yeah, it was strange for him to be with someone like Roger Moore, because here in America, I mean, Roger Moore was James Bond at the time, and they would hang out in France, where Roger Moore had a place, and their wives were friendly, and they went out in public. And if it was here in America, they would both get mobbed, but everybody in France was like knew who James Bond was, but they didn't know who Johnny was, and it was so strange for Carson to see this and just to I mean, he just wasn't used to it. It was such a different thing, when he did travel internationally.
You're listening to the Dr. Brian McDonough Show. My guest is Mark Malkoff, author of Love, Johnny Carson, also the host of more than 400 episodes. As I mentioned, I heard most of them. Some of the things I learned from your interviews, for instance, interesting things, like there was a gentleman who worked backstage who would offer drinks to people, or he was selling things on the side or whatever. And those kind of things went on because these people were there every day. It wasn't just a once a month show. It was a daily event.
Yeah, the backstage. I've heard some tales off the record as well. Yeah, there was some wild stuff. There was some calm stuff. It was, the 70s and the 80s. There were definitely a little bit of drugs and alcohol around. Definitely for the guests, they had alcohol available. But it was a family. It was a dysfunctional family sometimes, but I mean, I think that the common theme there is they wanted the show to be excellent, and whatever it took to achieve that, they would make that happen for Johnny. And they were just, I can't tell you how many people that were on that show. Just, it was devastating after 30 years, when not only to not be employed anymore, but just not to have those people around, not to see Johnny, and not to, people could be going through tough times, but when you're working on that show, just to have Johnny there he was gave them stability, and just was so funny for so many years, and comforted so many people that were going through tough times with those laughs.
I know when you were doing your podcast, Ed McMahon had passed away.
Yeah.
Doc Severinsen still alive and was still talking to you. Had Doc Severinsen as a guest. I know you had Ed McMahon's daughter as a guest.
Claudia.
A little bit there. Ed and Johnny certainly got along, but they weren't the tight, close friends that a lot of people think. They didn't really hang out together, did they?
Johnny was a game show host on ABC. It was a show called Who Do You Trust? And Ed was, I believe, the second announcer. And Johnny hired him, and they were tight for a while. They would go to Sardi's in between tapings. They taped at what is now the Helen Hayes Theater, the Little Theater. And early in the New York run, they were definitely pals, and, I know Johnny, when he was going through marital problems, so sometimes would go to Philadelphia or outside of Phila I guess it was King of Prussia, where Ed lived, and stay with the McMahons. There was definitely, a bond between them, and they just, Johnny just grew apart a little bit from Ed, especially in Burbank. They still they would do birthdays, they would do maybe I think their work anniversary of when they first started with each other. But, yeah, Johnny ran in different social circles than Ed. I think Ed would have liked to have been a little bit closer to Johnny, but they both knew they needed each other. I mean, Ed made that second banana thing look so easy that anybody could do it, but he could read Johnny's mind, and his accuracy was so high in terms of setting Carson up. There were a few times where he messed up the joke and Johnny was furious, and yes, Johnny would tell people behind the scenes he wish he could fire Ed, but I think that was just that one day he was just feeling that. But I mean, in terms of Johnny, his number one rule, which is very unique from a lot of the late night hosts, Peter Lassally, his producer, told me Johnny's number one rule was to make your guests look good. And Ed did that with Johnny. His whole job was to make Johnny look good. And Ed would hold back on certain lines that he knew would overshadow Johnny with laughter. And he knew what his role was. He stayed with that role.
There was one instance where Ed McMahon actually, and it's well publicized, had too much to drink. And I know you've addressed it in your show,
Yeah.
and you've addressed it. And Johnny made it really fun, though. He took an awkward situation and he actually made it quite funny.
Johnny knew about it before the show because Ed would always come drop by Johnny's dressing room just for a few minutes before. And it was clear Ed was tipsy and intoxicated. I mean, he normally didn't go out to lunch or drink during his lunch. That is Ed McMahon, but he was out with a writer named Pat McCormick, who was very wild, and Paul Williams. And they were I think, at the Polo Lounge in Beverly Hills. And Ed had found out, according to Ed, that he had I guess there was a litigation going on, and two things were settled in his favor. So he was celebrating. So he drank, I forget what the drink is called, but it's very potent. And he had a couple of those. And by the time that he got back to NBC Burbank, he had a driver, he had a limousine, thankfully, but he was intoxicated. And Johnny just started laughing when Ed walked in. And Ed, when he was doing the opening, slurred some of his words, which is Ed just didn't do that. He was such a perfectionist, and it was obvious that there was something going on there. And Johnny did try to, for a while, try to not bring attention to it too much, but then Ed kept interrupting Johnny, and finally, Johnny was like, Ed, you're not fooling anyone. And it was it definitely, it's one of a lot of people's favorite moments, but I feel like that is probably the one and only time that Ed was in that condition. But yeah, that definitely was shown in anniversary shows, and Ed would talk about that.
Do you realize that this book could be considered by many as the definitive book on Johnny Carson? And how do you feel about putting something like that together? Obviously, you gave a lot of your life to it because, I mean, if you listen to your interviews, I mentioned it earlier, you were exceptionally well prepared. I mean, guests
Oh, thank you.
time and time again would say, how did you know that? And you'd be like, well, I did a little research. But intricate details, you would have gone online and saw photos that Getty had or something from the past where people were together, and you would keep bringing it up. Or with Peter Lassally, I think you had on 3 times, and he constantly, who was obviously a legend, kept speaking about that. So tell me a little bit, putting the book together with all that knowledge, how did you even start writing?
First of all, that is so nice of you to say. I would say maybe definitive, somewhat on the Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson from 1962 to 92. But yeah, I mean, definitely Nebraska, and we talk about in a little bit of his radio days. But in terms of definitive, maybe the Tonight Show. But Johnny lived until 79 and lived a long life. He was born in Iowa and then got in first and second grade, moved to Nebraska. And I try to go in and gloss over that as much as I can, but it was one of those things. I felt this huge weight. First of all, there's so many people that just grew up watching Johnny, and what new things are there about Johnny that haven't been in books, because there have been so many Johnny books. So my goal was to give the reader as much new information as possible. I'd say the podcast is maybe the book is maybe 30%, 40%, maybe the podcast, and the rest is all new research and interviews I was able to do. So I thought it was fascinating. Like Johnny's very first show, I was able to talk to Mel Brooks and other people that were there and really try to put the reader right there on October 1st, 1962. What was going on backstage with Mel Brooks going up to Groucho Marx for his autograph, and just really a peek behind the scenes. I wanted to know what bits were staged, which were spontaneous. I really wanted to try to give the reader as much new things as possible. But we cover the show, we cover Johnny's retirement up until he passes away. I always say, people will say Johnny retired and he disappeared, which from the Tonight Show and he disappeared. But I always say Johnny left the Tonight Show in May of 92. And to me, he didn't retire for another 2 years. I always say May of 94, because within 2 years, he did Bob Hope's 90th birthday, the American Teacher Awards. He did The Simpsons. He went on Letterman. He did a few other things. So he was out and about. But yeah, he went to the White House and was presented by George Herbert Walker Bush. I think it was the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So he was definitely doing things. But after those 2 years in May of 94, he was gone. I mean, we get into the retirement years. People, I think more the media have tried to make him out to be in retirement, J.D. Salinger or Greta Garbo recluse, but he was not. He liked his alone time on his yacht, but at the same time, he was out and about having lunches with his writers. He was out on the yacht with Doc Severinsen and other friends of his. He was traveling with Jim Fowler to Africa. His friend Bob Wright, who was president of NBC, they would travel together all over the country. So he was definitely enjoying his life. I mean, he had his health issues, which was really hard on him, but he was one of those people, unlike somebody like Don Rickles, who just really needed to be in front of an audience up until he passed away. Johnny was able to step away and live a rich life and not need that audience in front of him.
Johnny Carson was with Doc Severinsen on his yacht, and he went out to swim, and that was the first time I think he realized the emphysema or whatever was catching up with him when he was struggling.
Yeah, that was shortly after the show, and I believe, at least on unfortunately, I don't want to get morbid, but I think on Johnny's death certificate, it said that he had been suffering emphysema for 20 years, which, I mean, he died in '05. So just to do the math, he would have had, emphysema for much longer than maybe he knew. It finally became public. I forget what year, and Johnny admitted he had emphysema, but that was definitely the start. I mean, he was one of those people that was smoking 2 packs of unfiltered Pall Malls a day, and it was one of the worst cigarettes to have. And people like Tony Randall would be these zealot anti-smokers and would give him a hard time, and he would just say, "There's nothing wrong with me. I can play 2 sets of tennis and not get winded." And it's funny because he was such a scientific guy about science, and he admitted he had seen what a smoker's lung looked like, the blackness and what it looked like, but still Johnny was just in major denial, and it did him in. I mean, his brother lived in up until I think his 90s. I mean, Johnny's about to would have turned 100, but it was just sad. And Johnny definitely regretted the smoking. He quit shortly after the show ended. He had tried to quit numerous times, and he quit for a while, and then unfortunately his oldest son died in a tragic accident, and he started smoking again. But after the show ended, he stopped, but it was just too late. I mean, he had started when he was, I think, at 14. His dad, Homer, was a chain smoker as well. I mean, just talking to the people that worked in entertainment, especially back then, and radio and TV, it just seems like it was everywhere.
I had an opportunity once, actually, I was in the green room going on to the Today Show back in the early mid-90s with Jim Fowler. And he talked about how his travels and what he had done. He didn't mention Carson because I maybe he didn't want to, but he said, "I travel with a lot of people. You'd be surprised. And it's one of the greatest experiences to get to know some of these people." Now that I know what you're talking about, it probably was Johnny Carson, because I think they went to Africa, right?
Yeah, it was something Carson always wanted to do, and his wife Alex really suggested that Carson bring his sons. So Carson lost a son, Rick, and then he had 2 sons, Chris and Corey. So Johnny took the sons. It was Johnny, it was his wife Alex, and Jim Fowler and his wife, and they were there, I think, for a few weeks, and it was life changing for Johnny. I mean, he just absolutely loved the pace of life, and he was such a curious person. He had learned Swahili enough to communicate with the people. I mean, when he went to Russia with Bob Wright and their wives, I mean, he learned enough. He was taking Russian lessons for months. He had somebody come to his Malibu home from one of those, I think it was Brex, or I forget what language service it was, to learn enough Russian to get by. And yeah, he was just really inquisitive, and he just loved Africa and went back there. But yeah, Jim was there for that. Jim had no idea. He told me I did not know Johnny was a pilot. I don't even think he had his license at that point anymore. But back in New York, he would take his young sons and he would fly. He got his pilot license. So he even this would have been, I think, 92, 90, maybe December of 93 or early 93, that he
Okay.
was flying an airplane in Africa with Fowler and
That
everyone.
makes
So
sense, and it
yeah,
fits the time range.
yeah.
It's interesting. I don't want to take too much of your time.
No,
I
it's
know you
fine.
got a lot, but in researching Johnny Carson's life and reading and doing this for the preparation for this interview, one of the things I probably shouldn't have been surprised, but he really had knowledge in a wide variety of areas. He was a voracious reader.
Yeah, Peter LaSalle, his producer, said he was the most well-read person that he had ever met. I mean, he could really converse almost about any subject, and things would come up on the Tonight Show, and he would be able to have an opinion or knowledge of it. I mean, he would read several newspapers, and just completely curious man. I mean, about just the world, and he was taking magic lessons in retirement. I mean, I think it's very telling that certain guests, he would always want to go to dinner with certain guests, and they weren't the A-list movie stars. It was, he would want to go to dinner after the show if Carl Sagan was on, if Jim Fowler was on, if Dr. Paul Ehrlich, who was advocate of population control, if they were on the show, a lot of times Johnny would want to have dinner with them and just ask them questions. I mean, he was extremely curious. There was a gentleman named Mel Fisher who discovered a treasure. I forget where it was, at Key West maybe. And Johnny had him on, a treasure hunter, and was so fascinated that their next break of the show, he went down to Key West and dove with Mel Fisher. I mean, that was a curiosity for somebody that famous, especially. It was remarkable.
He probably, what you tell me tells me that probably heading into retirement, he retired essentially to something because he had so many interests. He
Yeah.
probably was constantly learning in his retirement.
That's a really good point. Someone like Bob Hope, who Johnny looked at Bob Hope, who had apparently this was Johnny's version, didn't have any personal friends, no interest really outside of show business, maybe golf a little bit. And Johnny was so curious and didn't really understand why Hope needed to stick around. I mean, Johnny's whole thing was, if I don't want the quality of my work and my performance to dip. Johnny believed he did it at the Tonight Show up until he was 66. That the work speaks for itself, but he never wanted to become. He thought Bob Hope just stuck around too long. He thought Jack Benny, his idol, stuck around too long, and Lucille Ball, and he just didn't want to be like that. And he was very fortunate with his curiosity that he didn't yet. He was okay in retirement. He missed doing the monologue, and he would do jokes for friends. George Schlatter, who created Laugh-In, would tell me they'd be on the boat, and Johnny would just do like a 10-minute monologue for him, and then in his last year, Johnny, and I guess that would have been early 2004, started writing jokes privately. Started writing for jokes for David Letterman, and would send in monologue jokes that Dave would do, and Johnny got such a kick out of it and loved it. And it wasn't revealed until I think just maybe a week or two before Johnny passed away that was revealed that Johnny had been doing that, and Dave loved it. Johnny loved it.
That's great. Who didn't you get to interview or wish you could have interviewed, whether because they weren't with us or you didn't get them or whatever? Anybody in your research you wish you could have?
It's an excellent question. I really would have liked living. I would have really liked David Letterman. I would have loved Bette Midler. There's a talent coordinator that was there since the late '60s, Bob Dolce. I think those would have been people I would have loved to have talked to. I really wanted Burt Reynolds before he passed, and Don Rickles. Wasn't able to get them. Definitely Fred DeCordova would have been one of the holy grails, and Ed McMahon. But I was able to get so many people. I mean, I still can't believe the number of people that showed me so much kindness from the show, especially those New York years. I loved talking to people because, as you know, NBC erased most of those first 10 years. I mean, most of what exists from 62 to 72 during the New York years or Kinescope. Some things remain, but not much. But just to kind of hear those stories, because we do have the videotape, or the videotape exists for the last 20 years, but to just kind of fill in the mystery of what went on in New York, I thought was really great just to hear all the stories. But the people that worked on the show, I have to say, I would hear from people the podcast listeners around the country. Those are their favorite episodes by far. Like, they like Mel Brooks, they love Carol Burnett, the famous people, but the ones that I feel like really resonated the most with were the ones that were behind the scenes.
Absolutely. Peter Lasalle, who isn't just behind the scenes, was pretty much up front, but that
Yeah,
was fascinating. Charles Grodin and Dick Cavett. I mean, you had
yeah.
a number of people who talked about, again, you got them to talk about their time with Carson. You could talk to Dick Cavett about an incredible career, but you focused on a lot on the time he was with Carson.
Yeah, Cavett was a really interesting guy because he had worked for Jack Parr, and then he was hired as a writer in 1964 for Johnny, and was there for 2 years. And a lot of the writers back then told me that Johnny always favored one writer at the time, and Dick was that one. And at one point, he was getting like 80% of the jokes in the monologue were Dick's. And I mean, he told me, and I go into this book, there's one section where they talk about the day Stan Laurel passed away, and both Johnny and Dick Cavett loved Stan Laurel, and Dick was friends with Stan Laurel. And Johnny got to at least talk to him on the phone a few times when Stan had been in the hospital in California. He had been long retired and wasn't making appearances on anything. But yeah, Cavett remembers just going into the office. He had just heard on the radio that Stan Laurel had passed, and goes into Johnny's office to drop off his jokes. And Johnny had tears in his eyes, and he said, "You heard." And he asked if Dick would write something for that night for him to say about Stan Laurel, which Dick did. And yeah, it was really, that was another thing. The whole media calling him cold and aloof, and there's just so many times in the book, or where Carson was way more emotional than people think. I mean, he definitely. There were a couple times on the air where you saw that emotion. One was when Jimmy Stewart did a poem about his dog Bo, who had passed away recently, or just passed away. Carson had tears in his eyes. When Alex Haley, who wrote Roots, presented Johnny with the genealogy. Those are two examples, and definitely, I would say the last show, when Carson said goodbye, emotional, and then the penultimate with Bette Midler singing to him, tears in his eyes. It was funny because one of this longtime staff members, Jim McCauley, who booked primarily the comedians, and he was there, I think, from 1977 to 92. So there's Johnny is not emotional about the last show, about like a week or two before they went off the air. He's not emotional. He's not going to be maudlin. And maybe at that point, Carson didn't think he would be, but the emotions got to him and you could see it. It was clear as crystal.
What was really cool about that, there was a unique camera angle you didn't usually see with Carson,
That's right.
where you could see him while Bette Midler was singing.
Yeah, Johnny had rewatched that a few times, and he just said there was nothing in his career that was more magical than that. And you couldn't replicate, you couldn't manufacture. People have tried on those talk shows to try to replicate something like that, and it just has never worked. I mean, Bette Midler won an Emmy for it. To this day, and unless something changed, she has never purposely watched that tape of her singing to Johnny, just because she has so many good memories. It was so emotional. And Bette, after she sang to Johnny, she was supposed to sit down with him and they were going to talk, but Bette was just so emotional and ended up sobbing that she just put a Hawaiian lace, she's from Hawaii, over Johnny, and just ran off because she couldn't contain her emotions. And Johnny had tears in his eyes, and it was just the perfect way to go out. I mean, Johnny, he wanted that actually to be the last show, because you had Robin Williams, Bette Midler, and after they were done, they were like, "How are we possibly going to come back tomorrow and do another show?" This was the show. It's the show everyone remembers. But Johnny came back, and they did the final show without any guests, and it was clips and him talking to Ed and Johnny, and for the first time ever. And this was fascinating to me, and this was something that I really, one of the reasons that really did drive me with the podcast when I was watching the final show as a teenager, was they showed for the first time ever they showed 7 minutes backstage behind the scenes. They had never let cameras really behind the scenes to show how they put the show together. And those 7 minutes, I had so many more questions. And then the PBS documentary in 2012 from Peter Jones, Johnny Carson, American Masters. That was another thing. I devoured that, and I sat down with Peter Jones and I told him, your documentary was unbelievable. I have so many more questions. I have this idea to do a Johnny Carson podcast. And he said, Mark, you have to do this. Tell everyone I endorse you. And I called Peter the next day and said it meant so much. I got to talk to him. Like, who do you think I should have on this Carson podcast if I call it that? He's like, well, do you want Carl Reiner's home phone number? Do you want Doc Severinsen's cell phone number? Here is Angie Dickinson's email address. So the seas parted instantly. It was one of those things where the timing was just, whatever reason, the universe, God, whatever people want to say, I say God. Everything just fell into my lap. I mean, it was, and especially back then, I wasn't able to record podcasts like this remotely. I mean, it just didn't exist. So I was going to people's homes. I was with Carl Reiner in Beverly Hills in his home. I was with Paul Anka next to his big piano with all his gold records. I was with Angie Dickinson in Beverly Hills. It was definitely a unique time where the podcast market was not saturated. I would still have to explain what a podcast was. Now, former presidents have podcasts. It's everywhere. But I think it was a very unique time when I did this, and I think that is one of the reasons why it worked. And also, everybody, and I didn't realize this, wanted to talk about Johnny because he meant so much to them. Going on that show for some of these people was the highlight of their career. Jerry Seinfeld, who I did not get to talk to, who wouldn't talk to me, which is fine, still says to this day, with all his accomplishments, that going on Carson was the highlight of his career by far. That says a lot.
What's next for Mark Malkoff? I know, obviously, a lot of interviews about this book are going to be headed on your way. But what else are you? I know you're doing podcasts as well about late night, right?
Yeah, I'm doing a podcast for Late Nighter, which latenighter.com covers late night past and present. And Bill Carter, who wrote the book The Late Shift, does things for them. So I don't know. I mean, I've just been working on this book for 4 years. Between the podcast and this, it's about 12 years of my life. I have a couple other ideas for possible books or maybe some other projects, but this has been just so consuming. I'm not really sure what's next. There was definitely I feel like I'm happy how we told the Carson story. There's definitely other stories I'd be interested to tell. But Carson was just, to me, was just such a holy grail, because I don't know about you, but I can't think of anybody more iconic in entertainment that had more longevity, where there was so little information about them in the show. I mean, I didn't know what went on behind the scenes. I always wondered from the time I first saw the show when I was a kid, who's holding the curtain open for Johnny? How come nobody has ever interviewed him? Before I know it, I'm in Los Angeles with Irving Davis, who held the curtain open for Johnny in Burbank for 20 years, and hearing his story. So I feel like I've gotten almost all my questions answered, and it was definitely, I did not expect this thing to become what it was. And it was so nice that people like yourself followed me on this journey.
So you'll understand why I'm asking you this last question. You could probably predict it, but what are your thoughts, your memories, in your opinion, of Johnny Carson?
I think that Johnny Carson was the best late night host ever. He didn't innovate comedy like David Letterman, definitely the last, 30, 40 years. It was more of an influence on comedy, but Johnny, in terms of a host, is the gold standard, and still the late night hosts talk about him. Johnny has not been on the air for 33 years, and the hosts still talk about him. There was a poll a few years ago in Rolling Stone, greatest late night host ever. Johnny still took top prize. I mean, there was just something so likable about him. It was likability. He was himself when he was on camera, and he just really respected his audience. He demanded a lot of himself, and he never wanted the show to dip. And his competitiveness was something he struggled with. I don't know if he would have stayed number one for the whole time, but I can't think of any other entertainment figure that was so good with children, with animals, with senior citizens, people that were not famous, people that were A-list movie stars. How he could just talk to them and make them forget that millions of viewers were watching them. He would take the most terrified people, like Elizabeth Taylor, when she finally agreed to do the show in, I believe, February of 1992, before Johnny went off the air. She was so nervous, but right when she sat down with Johnny, the nerves went away. He had that power. There was something about him. He was created for that medium. He was, I would say, in terms of the catalog of what holds up, it says a lot that, I mean, the official Johnny Carson YouTube channel has over 1 million subscribers. I think the videos average over about 1 million views per video. I mean, people just miss him. I mean, this is decades later, and people are still finding out about him. I have people that are in college, people are in their 20s that will be like, Mark, I didn't know. I found Johnny Carson about YouTube and I found your podcast, and they're intrigued. And so much of the stuff holds up, which for comedy is very unique, and it's uniquely Johnny.
Mark Malkoff, thank you for taking the time. Mark Malkoff is the author of Love Johnny Carson. It's available everywhere, so go out and get it. It's a great read, and I'm telling you, I don't know if there's any book out there on this topic that would be better researched. So, Mark, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Brian. This was fun.